Hello and welcome to lecture number 31. This is topic 2.20, Race to the Promised Land, Abolitionism and the Underground Railroad. The first learning objective says, describe the role and skill of the Underground Railroad in providing freedom-seeking routes. The Underground Railroad was a covert network of black and white abolitionists. It was not one major unified network directing the escape of enslaved people. It was actually composed of separate networks operating independently of each other, connected by stations or places where enslaved people could rest on their way to a border city or a northern state. Many of the conductors or the people who led enslaved individuals across the Underground Railroad were former escapees themselves, who made it to the north and were going back to help family members, friends, or anyone else who required their help. The Underground Railroad helped enslaved people flee the South by providing transportation, shelter, and other resources needed to make the journey northward. This also included organizations and people in northern cities that kept escapees safe from bounty hunters, like vigilant associations. One of the most prominent ones was in Philadelphia. They would stand up to any bounty hunter that came into town and help hide the escapees until it was safe for them to come out. Finally, they helped them resettle in the Free Territories. Canada West, now known as Ontario, was a popular destination for people fleeing slavery in the South because the British had abolished slavery in 1833. Throughout its history, the Underground Railroad helped about 30,000 African Americans reach freedom. This is all within the context of worsening conditions for black families. There was a greater violence against enslaved people, a greater danger of separation because of the internal slave trade, and women were in greater danger of sexual exploitation because that was the only method of increasing the enslaved population. The escapes that occurred from the 1810s through the 1860s were different from the early attempts of running away in the 18th century. Previously, runaways tried to gain concessions within slavery, and many often returned to the plantation they had fled. In the Underground Railroad era, people were escaping slavery for good, with no plans of returning to plantation life. If they did return, it was to help others escape. Those who were escaping were called passengers, or continuing the terminology of the railroad, and their numbers increased with the expansion of technology, including the expansion of railroad tracks and steamboat routes. One of the most famous examples is Henry Box Brown, who escaped by putting himself in a shipping container and shipping himself on a railroad line to a northern city. After a couple of days in a box, he arrived and lived the rest of his life as a free man. His account was documented, and he obviously gained the nickname Box for his method of escape. By the 19th century, several southern states had laws against teaching enslaved people to read and write to prevent them from forging travel passes for escape. Southerners tried to catch on and keep the enslaved population from running away by having police patrols in southern steamboat wharves and in southern port cities. It wasn't until the 1820s and 1830s that these networks of the Underground Railroad really arose. Before then, most individuals escaped on their own. To curb the number of enslaved people running away, the U.S. government passed Fugitive Slave Acts. The first one was in 1793, marking the first time the federal government exercised its power to return fugitive slaves to their enslaver, as promised in the Constitution in Article 4. The 1793 Fugitive Slave Act was necessitated by the presidency of George Washington. He was a Virginia planter with many enslaved people and had to serve as president in the cities of New York and Philadelphia, areas where slavery was either abolished or on the path to gradual abolition. Washington worried that if he brought enslaved people with him to serve as domestic servants, they would run away and claim their freedom. One of the enslaved people owned by George Washington who famously ran away was Ona Judge. She took her freedom by running away in 1796 after serving several periods as a domestic servant for Washington in Philadelphia and getting exposed to what free life could be like. The more immediate reason for her escape was that she found out that she was to be given away as a wedding present to a different family member and did not want to be sold deeper into slavery, potentially down south. The Washingtons tried various attempts to recover Ona Judge, going as far as enlisting the help of the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, but she maintained her freedom until her death. The 1793 Act set a precedent for future legislation. It authorized local governments to legally kidnap and return escaped refugees. In 1850, as a means to keep the country together and get the northern states to compromise with southern states on the issue of the expansion of slavery, Congress passed another Fugitive Slave Act, which was even stricter. Under this act, agents recovering the enslaved people could deputize northerners to aid in the recapture, and any northerner who refused could face legal or financial penalties. Courts deciding whether the kidnapped escapee was a fugitive slave or already free were given greater incentives to declare them as slaves. The judges would be paid twice as much if they determined the person was an enslaved individual rather than free. Because of the dangers that enslaved people and former enslaved individuals who escaped to the North faced due to the 1850 Act, the population of Canada West increased by 12,000 between 1850 and 1860. The second learning objective is about the most famous constructor on the Underground Railroad. It says, explain the significance of Harriet Tubman's contributions to abolitionism and African American pursuit of freedom. Tubman was born into slavery in Dorchester County, Maryland, around 1822. While she was enslaved, she endured a major head injury at age 12 at the hands of her enslaver, who threw a large weight at her. In 1849, she fled her enslaver and became a prominent conductor on the Underground Railroad. She returned to the South at least 19 times, often to help some of her family members escape. She helped so many people escape that she was nicknamed Moses, which aligns with her deep Christian religious beliefs. Not only did her faith guide her, but she also used her adherence to Christianity to aid others in escaping. She sang spirituals, which were African American songs that adapted hymns from the Bible and often had coded messages or double meanings. These messages alerted enslaved people of either plans to leave or places to go. These songs can be categorized into either map songs or signal songs. Map songs would give directions on where to go and routes to take. Wade in the Water is a spiritual that would tell enslaved individuals to stick around major waterways and use them as navigation checkpoints to make their way up north. Signal songs could be used to indicate when it was a good or bad time to attempt an escape. Swing Low, Sweet Chariot would signify that the time was close to mounting an escape, while Go Down Moses could mean that there was a present danger or a hindrance, suggesting it would be safer to wait before attempting an escape. Tubman's bravery extended beyond her work on the Underground Railroad. In 1862, she joined the Union Army once they made their way to South Carolina. Initially, she worked in the Union-controlled areas around Port Royal as a nurse, cook, and laundress. Eventually, she transitioned into working as a spy because the Union Army found out she had extensive geographic knowledge and social networks of people around the South. She was easily able to infiltrate Confederate areas and report on fortifications and enemy positions of Confederate troops, helping the Union Army better prepare and mount their offensives. All her accomplishments are memorialized in the plaque posted in her home of Auburn, New York. The instance in which she was most involved in the Union campaign is in the Combahee River Raid, which took place from June 1st to June 2nd, 1863. She collaborated with Colonel James Montgomery to plan the raid, making her the first American woman to lead a major military operation. She led a flotilla of troops up the Combahee River, avoiding Confederate mines. The mission's objective was to destroy supplies, capture resources, and liberate enslaved individuals along the plantations bordering the river to weaken the Confederate supply lines. It was a Union victory, and they freed nearly 700 enslaved people and destroyed major infrastructure like mills and grain storage facilities, further weakening the Confederacy. After the Civil War, Tubman continued to fight for justice. She was active in the women's suffrage movement, working alongside leaders like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton to advocate for women's rights to vote. Despite her contributions, she struggled financially and was denied a federal pension for her work in the Civil War until 1899. Until then, she received a small amount in the form of a widow's pension. And finally, here's the recap. The Underground Railroad was a network that provided transportation and shelter to help enslaved people flee the South and resettle in free territories. Nearly 30,000 African Americans reached to freedom through the Underground Railroad. Congress enacted the Fugitive Slave Acts to legally kidnap and return escaped refugees to their enslavers. Harriet Tubman returned to the South at least 19 times, leading about 70 enslaved Africans to freedom. Tubman served as a spy and nurse for the Union Army during the Civil War, and she became the first American woman to lead a major military operation. Thank you for watching. If you would like to watch the next lecture, click the thumbnail on the screen, and if you would like more resources to help you study, you can visit apushlights.com/afam. I wish you the best of luck with your studies, and I hope to see you back on the next lecture.